I still see it the same way every time my mind drifts back, a dull green tent wedged under a tangle of roots, its fabric worn to the color of river stones, rainwater beading along the seam like cold sweat. Cedars leaned close, and what little sun made it through the canopy turned the moss a deeper green, like a breath held too long. A child's drawing simple lines, 4 figures holding hands fluttered from a damp pocket and stilled when the wind laid down. The creek below kept speaking steady as a metronome, as if it could out-talk what the mountain had already decided. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I tell these stories so good names don't get left behind in the timber. In 2003, my days began before the ridgetops caught first light. I drove the same 7 miles of Highway 20 from Marble Mount to the ranger station, with the window cracked an inch, even when the chill settled in the low 40s. The air up here has a way of cutting through whatever weight you carried from the night before pine resin, cold river, wood smoke from the handful of houses tucked along the Skagit. I liked that drive. It set the tone, quiet road, tall trees, nothing out of place. The station sat back from the highway on a gravel pullout you could miss if you weren't looking, a low building with a wide porch and a bulletin board pinned with trail updates, black bear advisories, and vanish and return stories that ended well enough. No one remembered the scare. I kept a thermos of coffee on my desk, a topo map behind glass on the wall, and a ledger where I noted down small things that mattered later. Barometer drop, a service road washout, a sighting of early snow up Sourdough. Nature doesn't send announcements. She taps your shoulder in half shadows and rising creeks. We measured time by the way the mountains changed color. September was a sweet spot, days pushing into the upper 60s, sometimes 70 degrees Eve in the meadows nights, cool enough that breath hung in the beam of a headlamp. The berries were mostly picked over by then, and the high trail stayed open dry to your boot soles, except after a stubborn fog. Families came with the predictable lists: 2 tents, a blue cooler, extra socks for the kids. I could look at a trunk full of gear and know how far that group would make it before they turned around. I kept a small routine that felt like insurance. By 8, I'd make a loop between the radio, the weather facts, and the front window that framed the first stand of furs. Volunteers filtered in retirees with time to give young couples trying out their new boots in the front country before committing to the high miles. I gave the same talk so many times, it became a rhythm, trail etiquette, animal distance, creek crossings the rule. I never bent, never camp right on the waterline. Rivers in this country rise faster than a person can argue. The Smiths and the Cleans fit the pattern of people who respected that rhythm. I didn't know them well then, not like I would later, but I knew enough. I watched them from the porch the way rangers do, counting heads, without seeming to scanning gear, listening for the kind of talk that tells you whether a group sees the mountain as a backdrop or as a partner you don't cross. They had the partner kind of look. Elias carried the weight, like men who know straps on their shoulders, steadily without fuss. He had a laminated map, and that slow, careful way you see in people who spend time outdoors on purpose. He nodded as I pointed out a spur trail that wandered into a meadow before it poured back into the main route. Mara stood with the cooler tucked under one arm, checking off items with a nurse's calm bandages, water filter, extra layers for night. When she smiled, it looked like she was making a decision to tuck worry into her pocket for later. The little ones stayed close by her hip, as if gravity held them there. Theo laughed at the smallest things and made the big pack look lighter than it was. He ran a hand along the tent poles, like a man checking a familiar set of tools. Nadia kept an eye on the boys with a teacher's radar. She had that look people get in the mountains, quiet at the edges from keeping track of everyone at once. The older boy, Owen, kept taking in the ridge like he wanted to memorize it, as if the mountain would grade him on it later. The younger Ethan held a toy truck for as long as the parking lot allowed, and then tucked it carefully in an outside pocket. I remember that pocket because it was bright and it caught the light. You'd think we'd all live inside heavy moments up here, but the truth is, the world before anything goes wrong feels ordinary, almost tender in its predictability. A dad checks a knot. A mom wipes fog off a pair of glasses. A kid jokes about who gets the last marshmallow at dusk. The creek noise folds into conversation so cleanly you stop hearing it until nightfall. That was our September. I stick to first names when I can. Rank is useful in an incident, but it doesn't do much at the trailhead. I gave the group the weather talk, checked their stove fuel, and made a mark on my map that I could find in the dark if a call came from that direction. I told them what I tell everyone: start early, keep an eye on the sky by mid-afternoon, and if a wind runs hard up the creek, don't camp low. The road up to the turnout where they parked is narrow and bends around a stand of alders that creep closer each year. You hear your tires crackle over the grit, and you hear the creek well before you see it. That water keeps its secrets, but it gives off a cold you can feel from the bank. The spur they chose doesn't look like much from the road. 2 tire ruts a gate. You move and put back a short walk to a flat, with a good place for a fire ring and a view through the trees if you stand in the right spot. Most folks passed it by for named trailheads. The ones who stopped were the kind who didn't need a sign to tell them what they already knew. The kids did what kids do when the air tastes like the first weeks of school and the mountains smell like cedar raced to nowhere and everywhere, then circled back when the adults called pocket checks, hats, gloves, headlamps. I showed them the safest way to cross the little feeder stream 2 steps on Rock 1 on the route. Don't trust the slick. They listened like listening was a game, each trying to be first to repeat the steps back to me. Somebody laughed. I don't remember who started it, only how fast it spread. Back at the station that afternoon, I logged a note for the spur. Nothing special. Late season family camp, 2 nights riverline caution. The sun shifted on the wall map and lit the route like a thin, pale thread, cutting under a ridge that always gains more wind than you expect. I don't traffic in superstition. You can't and do this job. But I remember running a finger across that same line twice. Habit, I told myself. A good ranger makes sure small things don't slip. Evenings belong to the valley the way shadows gather early and hold their ground, the smell of someone's dinner rolling off a back porch, the low idle of a truck easing past with a dog leaning out the window. I locked the station, swept the porch, and set the radio to a volume where it wouldn't startle me but would keep the silence honest. If a night call comes, you want it loud enough to cut through whatever dream you're in and soft enough that you don't resurface already running. Out here, our faith rests on routines stacked like cordwood. People say they'll be out of touch for a couple of days, and we nod. Folks in these hills still put trust in a note on the fridge and a route drawn on a folded county map tucked in the glove compartment. It's an old-fashioned system that works until it doesn't. On that Friday, there was no reason to think it wouldn't. Before I went home, I took a slow drive past a handful of pullouts we watch more closely once the nights cool off. I counted cars, jotted plate numbers on a small spiral notebook, and listened to the river. At one bend, a gust came up from the water and pushed cold air through the open window. September gusts are usually clean on then gone. This one felt different. It hung around and stirred the tops of the firs as if looking for something. I put a star next to the note I'd made that morning about the front rolling in Sunday night. Nothing dramatic, just a reminder to keep an eye on the gauges. Saturday ran like most Saturdays. A couple from Mount Vernon came in before breakfast to ask if a 6-mile loop would be too much for their knees. A high schooler volunteering for service hours learned how to tie a bear hang in under 2 minutes and earned herself a talk about ranger school. A father and son turned up after lunch to report a bright blue tent left at a trail junction. They'd moved it off the path and kept moving. We logged the location and sent a volunteer out with a pack to tag it. 99 times out of 100, it's a forgotten rental or an optimistic purchase someone decided to hate after a wet night. If there was a 100th time in that story, I didn't see it yet. The town kept its weekend promises. Marble Mount's diner filled with talk and the smell of bacon. Folks came through the station to point at the big relief map and mark where their grandparents used to fish before the rules changed. I listened to a story about a bear that never happened, smiled where it made sense, corrected the parts that could get somebody hurt. Afternoon sun warmed the porch boards, and I leaned against the rail with my coffee and watched dust lift where the road cut back to the highway. Not much moved. That was the point most days. Late afternoon, I stepped into the back room where we keep the older paper maps, the ones that show long-abandoned logging spurs and faint lines. Hikers rediscover every 10 years as if they laid them down themselves. I traced a route from the meadow up to a small ridge that doesn't look like much until you stand on it and feel how the wind changes direction without warning. People like to plan to catch the view around sunset there. I make a habit of reminding them that mountains carry their own clocks. Light falls fast when it wants to. Sunday morning came cool and clear, a low fog braided through the alder bottoms. By mid-morning, the fog lifted and the ridges stepped into view one by one, like a curtain pulled back. I stopped at the river gauge on my way to the station. It read higher than Saturday, not by much, but enough that I underlined the number in my ledger. When I reached the porch, a scrap of paper lay under the door, a neighbor's note about hearing what might have been a tree pop in the night up the valley, a common sound when temperature swings run quick. I tucked it into the day's stack. People returned in ones and twos to the parking areas by late afternoon. Boots' dusty faces shed of whatever city had tried to stick to them. Kids came back with pockets full of pine cones, and parents doing the math of miles versus bedtime. The rhythm soothes you if you let it, cars starting doors, closing the chirp of a tailgate locking shut. Dusk pressed in early, as it does once school is back, and the light decides your evenings for you. I waited a little longer than usual at the station. Sometimes groups hit a creek crossing late or stop for another look at the ridge and don't roll past our window until the last of the sky is down. I kept the porch light on, the kind with a warm bulb that makes the paint look the color of wheat. The radio stayed quiet. The map on the wall took on the same glow as a nightlight, its contour lines softening and then sharpening when a passing truck's headlights slid across the glass. I stood a minute longer, with the door half open, letting the cold ride in and the day ride out. A single moth circled the porch light, bumped the glass, and rested on the warm metal base. The highway beyond the trees offered a long dark with no interruption. I wrote myself a note to swing by that spur first thing in the morning, just to tidy up a fire ring and check for trash. Nothing urgent, just a habit that keeps a place orderly. Then I turned the light out, locked the door, and listened. The night answered with creak noise and wind in the high limbs, nothing else. No tires on gravel, no headlights rounding the bend, only the sound a valley makes when it's keeping its own counsel and expects you to do the same. By the time I pulled up to the ranger station the next morning, the sun was already sitting low over the peaks, the kind of light that looks colder than it feels. The porch bulb still glowed from the night before. I'd meant to switch it off, but something about that small circle of light against all that dark made me leave it. Habit, I suppose, keeping one lamp burning in case someone finds their way back. The radio was quiet. No calls, no chatter. It was Sunday, and most of the valley was still half asleep. I went about the usual routine, checking the weather feed, marking the water gauge readings, sorting through the weekend permits. Nothing unusual, just the quiet hum of a normal morning. Then around mid-afternoon, a note came through the volunteer network. 2 family vehicles still parked at the turnout by the North Fork trailhead. Their permits showed a planned return the previous evening. It wasn't unheard of. Sometimes groups lingered, decided to stay an extra night if the weather held, but something about it drew my attention. I made a mark next to their names, the Smiths and the Cleans. By 5, the clouds had thickened, and the air turned metallic the way it does before a storm. I drove out to the turnout, the gravel road winding like a ribbon through pines that bent close enough to brush the mirrors. The vehicles sat side by side, damp with dew, their windows clouded. A thin layer of dust covered the hoods, except where a handprint had smudged one clean child-sized by the look of it. Their permit slips were still tucked under the wipers. I leaned against my truck for a long moment listening. You learn to read the woods by sound, what belongs, what doesn't. What? That evening, the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no creek chatter from below, just the low drone of wind moving through the higher branches. I followed the spur trail for a short way, half a mile at most. The path looked recently used pine needles, pressed flat, faint scuff marks from boots heading in, but none returning. I stopped where the forest thickened into a darker wall. Night was coming fast, and even after all these years, I still respect what that means in the Cascades. I radioed in my location and noted I'd return at first light. Something told me not to push deeper alone. The next morning the rain came early, a steady gray curtain that blurred the ridges. I met 2 other rangers at the station, and by 8 we were on the trail. The climb was gentle at first, then narrowed into switchbacks that hugged the creek. We could smell smoke before we saw the clearing, a faint trace of burnt wood, not fresh, not old, just enough to catch in your throat. When the trees opened, the campsite came into view. 2 tents stood half-collapsed in the clearing, their zippers open, fabric slick with rain. A blue cooler lay on its side, the lid cracked, its contents washed into the mud. A child's sock, pale pink, clung to a root near the fire ring. The fire pit itself was cold, the ashes damp and untouched. I remember kneeling there, touching the ground. It was still faintly warm beneath the top layer, like it hadn't been long since someone had sat there. But there were no footprints beyond the immediate area, no drag marks, no broken brush leading away. Just an emptiness too clean to make sense. We called out their names one after another. The echoes came back flat. No birds, no movement, not even the usual rustle of small animals you get when the woods are curious about you. The only sound was water running fast and hard, somewhere below the slope. I marked the coordinates, took photographs, and bagged what I could: food wrappers, a bent tent stake, a single tin mug lying in the grass. The mug had a small engraving MS. By noon, search operations were in motion. Helicopters swept the ridgelines while teams moved through the gullies and feeder creeks. I stayed groundside with the mapping crew, logging every section we cleared. The rain eased by afternoon, but mist hung so thick you couldn't see 30 feet ahead. We found nothing. No gear, no footprints, not even signs of an animal disturbance. It was as if the families had stood up, stepped into the trees, and dissolved into the rain. Back at the station that night, I spread the topographic maps across my desk, tracing their route over and over. The Smiths and Cleans weren't the sort to take unnecessary risks. Elias had experience enough to know the rule about the creek. Theo was methodical by the book. Mara and Nadia, both meticulous in their notes, their permit even listed an estimated hiking radius within 3 miles of the campsite. They'd done everything right. And still, they were gone. For the next 3 days, the search expanded outward like ripples from a stone. We brought in dogs, drones, volunteers, even a mounted unit from the county. Nothing. The tents remained the only fixed point. I started sleeping in the station, listening to the radio crackle through the dark hours, each burst of static pulling me halfway out of dreams that weren't dreams at all, but flashes of that clearing the sock, the mug, the fire gone cold. By the end of the week, the air changed. It's hard to explain, but in cases like this, there's a point where search work turns into waiting. The forest becomes stiller, the calls quieter, and people stop saying when we find them and start saying if. I fought that shift as long as I could. Every morning I checked the river gauges, thinking maybe the creek had taken a sudden rise, carried them downstream. But floods leave traces, debris disturbed soil something. The ground around that site hadn't been touched by any rush of water. As October drew closer, snow dusted the high ridges. We pushed the lower searches until the last possible day before weather closed us out. The helicopters circled slower now, their sound more like a heartbeat fading than a promise. I walked the spur again, every foot of it with a metal detector checking for any glint of dropped metal jewelry, a buckle, anything. Nothing came up but nails from an old campfire ring and the odd pull tab from a beer can decades old. I sat at the edge of the trail, the map folded in my lap, trying to reconcile the impossible. 6 people, 2 families, 4 children vanished from a single open clearing. Through winter, the station fell into its quieter rhythm. Snow sealed the upper trails, and the case shifted from active to cold in the paperwork, though no one liked saying it out loud. I kept their file in the top drawer of my desk, not filed away, but within reach. Once a week, I'd pull it out, glance through the photos, the tents, the cooler, the mug, and jot down any new idea, however far-fetched. Most of those pages stayed blank. The family's relatives called from time to time, voices worn thin by distance and waiting. I tried to give them something solid, but there was nothing left to give. We're still looking, I'd say, though I knew looking meant a kind of vigil. Now maps memory, the occasional new tip from a hiker that led nowhere. Then came April. The thaw that year was fast violent, the kind that rips through snowpack and turns creeks into small rivers overnight. It was a Thursday when two college students, geology majors I learned later, stumbled into the ranger station soaked to the knees, their faces pale as ash. They'd been mapping erosion channels a few miles north of the main trail system when they found something they couldn't make sense of. We followed them out that afternoon, wading through meltwater and slick mud, every branch shedding rain, as if the whole forest were sweating. The ravine they led us to was narrow, deep, carved by years of runoff, the kind of place even seasoned hikers avoid. They're tangled under fallen branches, and a skin of moss was a tent. It wasn't new anymore, its green faded to gray fabric torn where the poles had given out. One corner still held a stake bent sideways. The rest had been dragged half-buried by silt. Inside, beneath a thin layer of soil, was a small shoe no bigger than my hand. The color was hard to make out, but the size told me enough. Next to it, a scrap of fabric blue with a white stripe, the kind of pattern I'd seen in the Clean Family's gear list months before. We bagged everything carefully, marking each piece. When I touched the tent's outer wall, it felt wrong, too smooth, too recently disturbed, like it hadn't been resting there long. Back at the lab, our forensic specialist, Dr. Evelyn Hart, ran sediment tests and confirmed what we feared: the soil trapped in the seams didn't match the campsite ground. It came from deeper forest, darker loamier, carried here by water. The pattern suggested it had been moved by flood or runoff, the kind of sudden surge that comes when early snow gives way all at once. That fit one theory, a flash flood hitting in the night, sweeping through camp before anyone had time to react. But if that were true, we should have found more sleeping bags, cookware, something. The tent was an orphan clue washed far from home. The find sparked new life in the case. We reopened search grids along the lower gorge where floodwater might have carried debris. Teams rappelled down rock faces, set lines across the creek. I went with one of the field units myself. It was there, while clearing brush near a runoff channel, that we spotted something glinting between stones, a metal bottle dented and scratched with two letters etched faintly on its side, TK Theo Clean's initials. We logged the find, photographed it in place, then looked farther upstream. In a thicket, not 10 yards away, a small backpack lay tangled in roots, the straps torn clean through. The patches sewn on the back cartoon characters, worn and peeling, made my stomach twist. Children's packs don't wander that far on their own. We followed the creek up another 100 yards and found a shallow recess in the rock wall, half a cave, half a collapsed pocket. Inside, we found scraps of clothing, the broken shell of a flashlight, and a toy truck still faintly red under the dirt. That one I remembered the youngest boy's. I had seen him carry it at the trailhead, holding it in both hands, like it meant something bigger than its size. I can't quite explain the stillness that settled over us then. It wasn't shock, it was recognition. That small cave with its soot-darkened stone and flattened soil spoke of people who had tried to survive. Maybe only for a night, maybe longer. As we combed through the cave's interior, the rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, washing away our footprints. It felt like the mountain reclaiming its silence. We finished the documentation, flagged the coordinates, and radioed in the news. That night I couldn't sleep. The images ran loops in my head: the toy truck, the torn pack, the shoe. I knew the odds, but I also knew human beings can surprise you, especially when it's life or death. There was a chance, however small, that someone had made it out. I wrote in my notebook, "Find the rest of the story." 2 days later, divers recovered a child's sandal from the creek bed. Pink strap, worn buckle. I didn't need a tag to know whose it was. We'd started to piece together a timeline. Now a flood tearing through the campsite, the families fleeing toward higher ground, perhaps reaching that cave before the current overtook them. But there were details that didn't fit the spacing of debris, the lack of human remains, the quiet precision of it all. Nature isn't neat. Whatever happened, it hadn't been purely the work of the elements. We pressed deeper into the gorge as the days went on. The floodwater had left deep scars, cutting new channels into the hillside. One afternoon near the upper basin, a ranger named Declan spotted something unnatural, a lean-to made of branches and tarp, hidden in dense brush. Inside, we found a page torn from a notebook, ink blurred, but still legible enough to make out a few words. Water rising. Kids safe. Moving uphill at dawn. The handwriting matched a sample we had on file, Mara Smith's permit form. I sat with that note in my hands for a long time before bagging it. It meant they'd survived at least for a while. It meant they'd fought hard to stay alive. But there was something else, something that chilled me more than any water or wind. Outside the lean-to in the soft earth were footprints, some small, some much larger than any of theirs. The smaller prints trailed off uphill. The larger ones went the other way. When we cast them in plaster, the pattern showed an uneven stride, one boot heavier than the other, like someone favoring an injured leg. It didn't belong to anyone in either family. That was the moment I realized we weren't alone out there. The forest has ways of keeping its secrets, but sometimes it also leaves you a whisper of the truth, just enough to keep you searching. That night, when I looked at the map by lamplight, the gorge lines seemed to shift, the ink running faintly at the edges like water had touched it. I followed those curves with my finger, tracing the same path they must have taken, and for the first time since September I felt something sharp and cold in my chest. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was knowing the story wasn't finished, and that whatever we were about to find next would change everything we thought we knew about that night in the Cascades. It's strange how the forest remembers things you'd rather forget. Even now when I walk those trails, I can feel the air change around that ravine, as if the mountain itself knows where we last saw signs of them. After we found Mara's note and those unfamiliar boot prints, the investigation shifted from what we thought was a natural disaster to something darker, something that walked on two legs. We'd been calling it a flood case up until then, a tragic accident in rough country. But boot prints don't form themselves, and they don't lie. That night, I sat at the station alone, the radio quiet, the maps laid out beneath the lamplight. The wind outside carried a hollow sound, almost like breathing, as it slipped through the cracks in the siding. I marked the spot where the prints had been cast, then drew a line northeast toward the ridgeline. That direction led into country few people ever see: old trap lines, disused logging spurs, and hidden cabins built before the park was ever declared. Men who wanted to disappear used to live out there, and some still did. By dawn, we had a full search team, rangers, deputies, and one state investigator named Declan Moore. Declan was quiet but sharp-eyed, the kind who'd stand still for 10 minutes just to listen. The forest was dense where we started, full of dripping moss and fog that settled low enough to beat on your eyelashes. We worked in a slow grid, each of us spaced 20 yards apart, radios clipped to our vests. The soil was slick underfoot, dark with runoff. Every now and then I'd catch the smell of something faintly sour, like old smoke carried on wet wind. Around mid-morning, one of the deputies called in. He'd found a structure about half a mile upslope from the gorge. When I reached it, the first thing I saw was a tin chimney pipe poking through the brush, leaning like a broken finger. The cabin was small, built from hand-cut logs, and patched with sheet metal. A single window was covered with plastic stapled tight. No footprints out front, no sign of fresh use, but the door hung on one hinge like someone had left in a hurry. Inside was the kind of stillness that feels watched. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight. There were empty cans stacked in a corner, a cot draped with a torn blanket, and on the table a rifle. It was old 30-06 clean but unregistered. Declan found a stack of small pelts under the bed, all tagged with dates that matched the same week our families vanished. That told us plenty. Poachers. Men who lived just far enough from the law to forget it existed. We ran prints off the rifle, and the cans sent them down to the state lab. A name came back 2 days later: Harlan Reed, local trapper known for selling hides under the table and running venison to small towns when times were lean. No violent record, but a man with reasons to keep quiet. We found him at a gas station off Highway 20, standing beside a rusted truck filling it with diesel from a jerry can. When he saw the uniforms, he froze like an animal scenting a snare. The interview started easy. He said he'd been up in the hills hunting elk when the storm hit last September, claimed he'd seen the flood from a distance, heard trees breaking loose like matchsticks. He said he came across wreckage, but it was too dangerous to go near. The more he talked, the more his hands shook. He wasn't scared of us. He was scared of memory. Declan asked if he'd found any survivors. Harlan's mouth twitched. If I did, he said quietly, they were already gone. That was the first lie we caught him in. When we pressed him, the story cracked open. He admitted he'd found them. 8 people, 2 families battered and half drowned in the mud. Said he gave them food, promised to hike for help. But when he came back, they were dead. That was how he framed it, at least. He left them there and took what supplies he could carry. I panicked, he muttered. Didn't mean no harm. His words sat heavy in the air. The next morning, we hiked back to the site with him leading. He moved slow, like every step added years to his body. When we reached the lean-to where Mara's journal had been found, he stopped and wouldn't go closer. It's there, he whispered, pointing toward the thicket. We searched it top to bottom, but the earth told us little. The structure had half collapsed and the ground beneath was churned by weather and time. Still you could feel it, the weight of what had happened. Back at the station, we cataloged the confession. He hadn't killed them outright, but leaving them was its own crime. Still, something didn't fit. The boot print pattern we'd cast from the site showed a wider gait than Harlan's, and one heel was worn in a way his boots weren't. Either he wasn't alone that night, or he was lying about the timing. When we asked if anyone had been with him, he went silent. The air in the room thickened until all you could hear was the tick of the clock. Finally, he said one name, Cal Mercer, claimed Cal had been passing through helping with traps. He's gone now, Harlan added, eyes on the floor. Headed north before the snow, we ran Mercer's name through every local registry. Nothing. He was a ghost. But poachers like that move in small networks, and sure enough, a trail surfaced a few sightings near Diablo Lake, an old pickup abandoned by a logging road. When we searched it, we found rope in the back frayed at the ends, and a torn photograph tucked in the glove box. The image was water-stained faces half gone, but one detail stopped us cold. A young boy no older than 8 standing beside a man who matched Mercer's description. I didn't want to believe it, but the hair, the small frame, even the shape of the backpack, it all matched Ethan clean. It looked like he'd been alive after the flood. That night, I sat in my office staring at the photograph until the light outside turned silver. If it was true, if one of those children had survived only to end up in the hands of the same men who abandoned them, then this wasn't neglect. It was something crueler. We assembled a task force coordinating with state police and the National Park Service. For 3 days, we followed every trace tracks, trap lines, makeshift camps. Finally, a hiker near the Skagit River reported seeing smoke from a remote cabin, too steady to be a brush fire. We went in before dawn, the forest dripping from last night's rain silence so thick you could hear your own pulse. The cabin stood alone, deep under the pines. Inside, the air smelled of damp ash and unwashed clothes. We found canned goods, animal hides, and a ledger scribbled with numbers. But in the corner, half buried under a pile of blankets, lay a small backpack, faded red. We unzipped it and found a child's notebook inside the name Ethan written across the first page in unsteady print. The entries stopped mid-sentence. It's a strange thing touching handwriting that young. You can feel the tremor of the child who made it the way their world shrank to a few lines of paper. He wrote about a man with a bad leg and trees that talk when it rains. He drew stick figures, one tall, one small, walking beside a river. The last line read, "Going home soon." When we showed the notebook to Harlan, he broke. Said Mercer had taken the boy after the flood, claiming he'd keep him safe, maybe raise him like a son. "I thought he'd bring him down," Harlan muttered. "Didn't think he'd keep him." The story spilled out in fragments, how they'd both come upon the families after the storm, how Harlan panicked when he saw the injuries, how Mercer saw something else opportunity. We found Mercer 3 days later, camped near the same river Ethan had drawn. He looked like a ghost, thin gray clothes in tatters. When Declan and I approached, he didn't run. He just sat by his fire hands trembling. "He's gone," he said before we even spoke. "The boy's gone." He claimed the child had fallen ill, fever, maybe pneumonia, and died before winter. He said he buried him near the water but couldn't remember where. We searched that entire stretch of river for a week. On the 8th day, divers surfaced with a small bundle of bones tangled in roots. DNA confirmed it was Ethan. I've been in this job long enough to know closure is a word people use when they want to end something that shouldn't be ended. Finding him didn't close anything. It only made the silence heavier. Harlan and Mercer were charged with neglect obstruction and theft of federal property for taking the family's gear. It wasn't enough, but it was all the law could name. The ledger we'd found in the cabin told another story, columns of numbers, initials beside each records of illegal sales. It tied both men to a larger poaching ring operating through the Cascades, a network that stretched into Canada. I sent the pages to the regional office, knowing we were just brushing the edge of something wider. That spring the valley thawed fast, washing away the last traces of snow from the ravine. When I walked the trail again, everything had changed. The air, the light, even the sound of the creek. But sometimes when the wind dropped, I could still hear faint laughter rolling down from the ridgeline, the kind that doesn't belong to memory, but to the place itself, echoing what it lost. On the drive back to town one evening, I passed the turnout where their cars had sat. Grass had grown through the gravel. The sign for the trailhead was faded now, the paint peeling in long strips. I parked anyway, got out, and stood a while by the trees. The forest was quiet the way it gets before dusk, when the world seems to pause and decide what to keep hidden. Somewhere beyond those ridges, men like Mercer and Harlan had moved unseen for years, and maybe others still did. I locked the gate behind me when I left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, unfinished. There were too many footprints leading off in too many directions, and though the case had names and sentences attached now, the mountains weren't done with their story. They never are. The morning the trial began, a low fog clung to the courthouse lawn, heavy enough to blur the edges of the crowd that had gathered. Reporters, family members, people from town who'd followed the case since the beginning, they all stood there quiet, waiting for doors to open. I parked a block away and sat in my truck longer than I should have, watching the vapor roll off the windshield. I'd been in that building before, but never for something that carried this kind of weight. When I finally stepped out, the cold went straight through my jacket. The air smelled of wet pine and diesel from the idling vans that lined the curb. Inside the courthouse felt smaller than I remembered. The benches creaked under the weight of too many people, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant bees. Across the aisle, the family's relatives filled 2 full rows. I recognized their faces from the early search days, drawn pale older now by more than just time. When the bailiff called for silence, you could hear the echo of boots from the hallway before Harlan Reed and Cal Mercer entered. They didn't look at us. Harlan walked stiffly, his hands trembling as he took his seat. Cal's expression was harder, his eyes fixed straight ahead, like he'd been rehearsing how not to care. I took the stand the second day. The prosecutor asked me to walk the jury through what we'd found the campsite, the cave, the lean-to, the items that had surfaced over months of searching. I spoke in the same tone I used at the ranger station, factual and steady, but inside my stomach was tight. When they brought out the evidence boxes and opened the one containing Ethan's backpack, the room went quiet in a way I'll never forget. You could hear the sound of paper being unsealed, the faint crackle of the plastic bag as it was lifted. No one moved. Then came Dr. Evelyn Hart, the forensic specialist. She laid out the sediment samples, rope fibers, and tool marks, explaining how they tied Harlan and Cal to the stolen supplies and to the cabin where the ledger had been found. Her voice never wavered, but she paused when they handed her the notebook, the one with Ethan's handwriting. She read one line aloud, the one about going home soon, and the jurors sat back like the words had hit them physically. I looked down at my hands. My fingernails were rimmed with faint black from the graphite pencil I'd used that morning to annotate maps. I remember focusing on that small detail because the alternative was thinking about what the boy must have felt writing those words. When it was Harlan's turn to speak, his voice was thin, cracking in the middle of sentences. He said he'd never meant for harm to come to anyone, that the flood had scared him, that he'd tried to help, but froze when he saw how badly they were hurt. He talked about panic, about shame, about walking away, and trying not to look back. Cal, sitting beside him, shook his head almost imperceptibly. When his turn came, he denied most of it, claimed he'd only taken the supplies to survive the winter. But when the prosecution showed the photograph from the cabin, The blurred image of Cal and the young boy beside the river, his composure faltered. He stared at it for a long time before saying, "That's not what it looks like." Over the following days, the testimony built like layers of sediment. One witness after another, a ranger who'd seen smoke in the gorge, a trapper who'd heard voices along the ridgeline that fall, a hiker who'd found a rusted knife with unfamiliar etchings. Each story added weight, pressing down on whatever excuses remained. The defense tried to paint both men as victims of circumstance, men who'd made mistakes, but not crimes. But there was no way to frame abandonment as mercy. The notebook, the footprints, the ledger, they told a different story. On the seventh day, a man named Gideon Hole came forward unexpectedly. He'd been a trapper too, once part of the same poaching ring the ledger hinted at. His hair was white now, his hands marked with old frostbite scars. He spoke quietly, his words almost lost in the murmur of the gallery. Said he'd seen Cal with a child near the river weeks after the storm, carrying him piggyback through shallow water. The boy was alive then, he said, eyes unfocused, and he looked tired. The room stayed silent after that. No one coughed, no one shifted. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how much of human noise is just avoidance. The verdict came 3 days later. The jury foreman read it slowly, his voice careful and deliberate. Guilty on all counts, neglect, obstruction, theft, and reckless endangerment. 15 years for Harlan, 20 for Cal. The sentences sounded heavy when spoken aloud, but sitting there I couldn't feel any sense of justice. Not really. The families were still gone, the mountain still holding what it wouldn't give back. Harlan wept quietly at the table. Cal kept his head down, staring at his cuffed hands, as if he might find an explanation in his own fingerprints. After the courtroom emptied, I stepped outside into the sharp winter air. The mountains were visible through the fog that had lifted during the hearing, their peaks white against a pale sky. Across the street, the family's relatives gathered near the courthouse steps. They stood together without speaking, a kind of solidarity born from exhaustion. I started toward them, then stopped halfway. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. Instead, I turned back toward the truck and started the long drive up the valley road. For a while, I tried to let the case rest. I filed the reports, archived the evidence, sent copies to the state office, but the ledger kept circling my thoughts. There were too many entries, too many initials that didn't match anyone we'd arrested. The handwriting changed partway through, sharper, more deliberate. One of the names repeated several times Jasper. Nobody by that name showed up in any of our local records. Still, something about it clung to me like a burr under the skin. Early the next year, we teamed with investigators from the Canadian Border Unit. They'd been tracking a similar poaching operation that used the same pricing codes found in our ledger. The network ran deeper than we'd realized, illegal hides, ginseng, sometimes contraband, moving along the same trails our hikers used. If Jasper was real, he wasn't some backwoods drifter. He was organized, calculated. We sent samples of the handwriting to a forensic analyst. Weeks later, the results came back linking it to a man named Roland Tate, a trapper caught years earlier for smuggling rare pelts across the border. He'd been released on parole 2 years before the families vanished. In January, after nearly 5 months of paperwork and dead ends, a tip came in from a cabin raid north of the border. Inside, they'd found crates of ginseng and a journal written in the same hand as the ledger signed Jasper. There were entries dated the same week as the flood mentioning cleanup and moving south before the thaw. The timing was too exact to be coincidence. It meant those men or their associates were in the gorge when the storm hit. Maybe they'd stumbled upon the families. Maybe they'd been the reason Harlan and Cal ran. That knowledge settled on me like frost spreading slow but sure. We weren't dealing with a single act of cowardice anymore. We were looking at a chain of fear, one man hiding from another, leaving innocents to pay the price. I coordinated with border authorities for one last sweep before the snow shut us out again. We found a burned camp deep in the upper basin, the ashes still laced with bits of melted tarp and a rusted knife handle. The blade had been snapped, buried halfway into the earth, as if it had been stomped down. Near it, half buried under a fallen log, we found a metal box. Inside was a child's necklace, small and silver, the initials LS, engraved on the back. Leah Smith. I don't remember breathing when I saw it. We'd been searching for so long that most of us had stopped hoping to find anything personal again. The box also held a folded scrap of paper, part of a map, with an X drawn near the gorge. The ink had bled, but the lines were clear enough. It wasn't a treasure map. It was a signal, maybe even a plan, a last attempt to mark where they were before the flood took everything. When Dr. Hart analyzed the soil inside the box, it matched samples from the shelter site where we'd found Mara's journal. It meant that someone, maybe Mara herself, had buried it after the storm. That small act of intention changed everything for me. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was proof of a mother trying to leave a message, hoping someone someday would find it. We followed that clue back into the basin later that September, when the weather finally cleared enough for helicopters to fly. From the air, the terrain looked almost peaceful, green slopes, threads of silver water glinting between trees. But the gorge beneath still held the scars of the flood-deep trenches carved through rock like veins. We landed near the coordinates marked on the map and began to dig. A few hours in, one of the team called out. Buried beneath a tangle of roots was the corner of a plastic bag sealed and weighted with stones. Inside was a single page written in ink that had barely survived the years. It was Mara's handwriting again. The note was dated September 15, 2003, 2 days after the families had vanished from the main campsite. It spoke of the flood of Elias's broken leg, of their plan to climb to higher ground at dawn. It ended with a plea only 3 words long: "Find us, please." We stood there a long time, no one speaking. The wind moved through the gorge, carrying the sound of water against stone, and for a moment it felt like the mountain was breathing again. We'd always assumed they'd been lost, instantly taken by the flood without warning. But this note proved they'd survived for days, injured, scared, still fighting. That realization hit harder than any confession or verdict ever could. As the light began to fade, I packed the note carefully and sealed it in an evidence bag. The others hiked back toward the helicopter, but I stayed behind for a few minutes longer. From where I stood, I could see the line of the creek, the same path that had carried the tent, miles downstream. The sky was streaked pink and gray, the kind of color that makes the land look timeless. I don't know if the people responsible for that night truly understood what they'd done, or if it mattered to them at all. The courts would call it justice. The papers would call it closure. But for me, standing there above the gorge, all I could think about was how much of the story was still buried under that soil, how much the mountains still refused to give back. I started down the ridge as the first chill of evening settled in. Behind me, the wind picked up scattering dry leaves across the rocks. Somewhere in that sound, I thought I heard a faint echo. Not voices exactly, but the memory of them. It reminded me that the case wasn't over, not really. We had new names in the ledger now, a trail that ran north toward the border and beyond. And before winter closed in again, we meant to follow it. The first snow of that winter came early. It dusted the ridge like powdered glass, soft enough to muffle sound, but heavy enough to bend the smaller trees. From the porch of the ranger station, I watched it fall for a long time before unlocking the door. The office smelled the same as always, pine cleaner, wet wool, old paper. But something in the air felt different. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the knowledge that for the first time in 2 years, there were no active search grids on the board. The case was officially closed, and the mountain, at least on paper, was silent again. We'd finished our last sweep in late October, combing the upper basin where the map and the note had led us. The ledger trail had gone cold. The man called Jasper Rowland Tate was dead by then, found frozen in a hunting shack across the border. The journal beside him matched the handwriting from the poaching records, and one final entry read, "Only, the gorge is clean. They won't find it all." I remember reading those words under the harsh light of the evidence room and feeling something small and old snap inside me. It wasn't anger. It was fatigue, the kind that sinks into the bones. By the time we confirmed the handwriting, it didn't matter. The network he'd built unraveled fast after his death. Arrests came in slow waves through the winter, one name after another, middlemen suppliers, men who'd bartered pelts and roots for cash. Some cooperated, some didn't. None of them spoke about the night of the flood. They'd all heard stories, but when pressed for details, they claimed ignorance. The silence felt rehearsed, like men who'd learned long ago how to bury guilt under routine. For the family's relatives, the verdicts brought mixed relief. There were memorials, of course, services in town plaques at the trailhead, a grove of cedars planted by the creek where the tents had stood. I went to one of them that December. The air was sharp and the ground crunched underfoot. Someone had tied ribbons to the young trees, 8 ribbons in all, one for each life lost. When the wind passed through, they whispered like quiet voices talking over one another. The ceremony was small, maybe 30 people, most of them neighbors, rangers, or volunteers who'd searched those woods shoulder to shoulder with us. No one said much. You could feel how words had already failed this story too many times. Afterward, I stayed back while the others drifted toward their cars. The snow had begun again, soft flakes catching the last of the daylight. I looked at those ribbons and thought about how far sound travels in a place like this. I'd learned over years of searching that the forest keeps its own form of memory, even when storms strip the branches bare and rivers shift their beds. Something remains, a trace in the soil, a fragment under moss, a faint echo caught between ridges. That's what grief is too, I think. It changes shape, but it doesn't vanish. It just settles deeper. Through the spring that followed, I stayed in touch with Dr. Hart as her lab processed the final pieces of evidence, the fabric from the cave, the soil from the box, the metal clasp of the necklace. None of it changed the outcome, but it confirmed what we already knew: the families had survived longer than anyone thought. They'd fought for days, maybe a week, before nature and neglect did what cruelty alone could not. That knowledge brought its own kind of peace. It meant their story wasn't just one of loss, it was also one of endurance. They hadn't simply vanished. They had lived until they couldn't anymore, holding on to each other in the dark. Sometimes I replay the last day I saw their families alive, the way the kids had laughed near the trailhead, how the parents had balanced maps and gear, and that restless kind of excitement people bring to the wilderness. None of us thought it would be the last morning they'd ever see. We all assume the wild will give us fair warning before it turns, but that's not how it works. Out here, change comes without mercy or explanation. One crack of thunder, one shift in wind, and you're at the mercy of a place that's older than any of our fears. I retired the following year. 28 seasons in the park was enough. I still live nearby, a few miles downriver, where the water slows and widens before it hits the dam. On clear days, you can see the same ridges that frame their campsite. They look peaceful from this distance, green, almost gentle, but I know better. Every scar in that landscape tells a story, and some of those stories still have teeth. Visitors ask me sometimes if the Cascades ever feel haunted. I tell them not in the way people mean when they talk about ghosts. The haunting here is quieter. It's in the sound of wind brushing through cedar needles, the cold smell that comes up from the creek just before dusk. It's in the way a certain patch of moss refuses to grow back where the tent once stood. You can't see the loss, but you can feel it if you know where to stand. A few years ago, the Park Service installed a plaque along the trail, a simple bronze plate mounted on a rock. It reads, "In memory of those who sought peace in these mountains and found silence instead." Hikers leave small offerings there now: stones, pine cones, bits of ribbon. I pass it every so often on patrol, though I don't linger long. I don't have to. I already carry the memory with me. The Smiths' relatives moved east. The Clean's surviving family started a foundation for backcountry safety education, focusing on flood awareness and first response training. Every year they host a memorial hike near the same creek. I've gone once or twice walking at the back of the line, listening to the steady rhythm of boots on dirt. It's a small thing, but it's enough. The older I get, the more I think about the line between justice and understanding. We caught the men who could be caught. We buried what we could find. The rest belongs to time now and to the land. What still bothers me isn't what we missed, it's what we'll never know. Maybe that's the price of doing this work for too long. You stop believing in closure and start learning how to live with unfinished stories. Last month I took a drive up the highway where the first search began. The old turnout where their cars had been parked is nearly gone now, swallowed by brush. I stopped anyway. The forest was thick with fog, and a jay called somewhere overhead, sharp and lonely. I thought about how that road looked 20 years ago, how two families had driven it full of plans the kids probably pressed against the window, counting peaks as they went by. There's no sign of them there now, no marker, just the ordinary silence of the woods, doing what it's always done, enduring. I left a small stone on the post where their permit once hung, nothing fancy. The fog swallowed it almost instantly, but that's the nature of remembrance. You don't leave something behind to be seen. You leave it so you know you haven't forgotten. People like to believe stories end neatly, that every mystery can be solved if you look hard enough. But standing there listening to the rain gather in the leaves, I knew better. Some stories don't close, they echo. They fade and return quieter each time, until all that's left is the reminder that a handful of good people once walked into the woods and never walked back out. I turned the truck around before nightfall headlights cutting through the mist as I drove back down the valley. The radio stayed off. I didn't need noise to fill the space. Sometimes silence is the only honest way to honor what's gone. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Every time we speak their names, we pull a little light back into the world, and maybe that's the closest thing to justice any of us ever get.